All right. G'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis, podcast where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name is Pietro, and I'm super excited today. I've got a fantastic guest for everyone. I think it's safe to say we've got the most prominent libertarian in Australia to talk to today, which is fantastic. So I'm very pleased to welcome to the show the current Libertarian Party member for Southeast Metro and certainly most recognizable libertarian that I can think of that I know. Welcome to the show, Mr. David Limbrick. How are you?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, great to be here.
So we have spoken once before on the show when I came to visit Parliament and Spike Cohen was there, and we went into the whole background story of how you became a libertarian and all of that, those questions that I tend to ask at the start of the show. So if anyone's interested in that, you can go check out our previous episode with David if you want to know a bit more of his backstory. But there's just so much interesting stuff happening in Victoria at the moment that I wanted to get him on to talk about some specific issues and nut down into some of these. Um, so, the big one that is probably about 2 weeks old now is that recently the CFMEU, the Construction, Manufacturing and Maritime Employees Union, has come under immense scrutiny here in Victoria, but also other states because of that, following a 60-minute expose, so about 2 weeks ago. So for those who haven't kept up to date, do you mind going through the sort of broad strokes of what's been happening?
Yeah, so look, I'll say up front that all these things are allegations at the moment. There was a lot of things aired on the 60 Minutes interview and in the newspapers and those sorts of things. But effectively, the allegation is that there is a whole raft of corruption within the industry. So kickbacks, preferred suppliers getting access to jobs, all these sorts of things. And ultimately, that would have the effect of pushing up prices of government construction projects. I'm not convinced it's just limited to the CFMEU. In fact, I'm not convinced that it's not, sector wide, but certainly the focus has been on the CFMEU with this reporting. Many people have been coming out and saying that, well, this has been happening for years. It's nothing new. That's probably true. I don't know. But yeah, certainly there's been a lot of people that have been saying that this sort of heavying has been going on for years. Now, the key to it all seems to be about the enterprise bargaining agreements. So the idea is that the union negotiates an EBA between the government and its members. They agree on that, and then third-party contractors that come in to do work on the sites. Of course, they're huge contracts. They're not done by a single company. They're done by lots of companies that deal with it. They effectively approve other companies to use their EBA, and that's sort of like the password, if you like, to getting onto these sites and getting access to the jobs. And the allegation is that process has become corrupted, that some companies get access to it by paying money or through various other means. And there's various mechanisms through which they've done that. Now, one of the mechanisms that they spoke about on 60 Minutes was through specialist labour hire companies. So on government contracts, they've got effectively diversity requirements, right? They say, the government doesn't just say, give me the best product for the best price from a company that can deliver, which is what I think the government should be judging these things on. They also have a whole bunch of other requirements. So things like, you need to have gender equality action plan and this sort of thing, or you need to have a certain number of Indigenous workers and things like this. And one of the examples given on 60 Minutes was an Indigenous labour hire company to supply Aboriginal workers, and they claimed that process had been corrupted. And I wouldn't say that it's just limited to that speciality of labour hire company. In fact, I think it's probably far more widespread than that. But certainly that was one of the examples given. And the concern here is we don't really know the scale of this, like how big are we talking? Is this like something that's small and isolated, or is it systemic and widespread? How much has this been pushing up the cost of government contracts? We know that a lot of these projects have been running over budget. How much has this actually contributed to that? Is it a significant factor? And I think we don't know the answers to those questions just yet. So there's been a range of actions that have been announced on this. So the CFMEU itself has been put under administration. So I think they've replaced the board. They've removed, I think I read in the papers, it was about 20 employees that were apparently somehow connected to nefarious groups. And the federal government has said that they're doing something about it. The state government has said that they're launching an inquiry. They've appointed someone within the public service to launch an inquiry. There's been calls from the opposition in Victoria to have a royal commission. The state government has the power to do that, but they have so far refused to initiate a royal commission, which of course has very coercive powers to be able to compel people to appear and compel them to speak and all sorts of things. And then this week there was an attempt on Wednesday by the opposition to set up what's called a select committee. So this is if you're not familiar with what that is, basically Parliament has all these committees that MPs can take part in. And occasionally they set one up called a select committee, which is a special committee, not a standing committee, special committee for a specific purpose to undertake some function. And in fact, I'm the chair of one of these committees. I'm the chair of the inquiry into the Commonwealth Games bid. And that's a select committee. The opposition wanted to set up a committee specifically to investigate what's been going on with the CFMEU on Wednesday. That attempt failed. It was effectively blocked by the Greens. They voted against it, and that meant that the upper house didn't have the numbers. I'd say, for the record, I did support setting up that select committee. Personally, I would rather a royal commission, even though it's expensive and would take more time. I think that we do need to get to the bottom of this. However, that's not going to happen, at least not yet. And a select committee is not going to happen yet either. I would say another action, an action that I took, which is something within my power as an MP. I wrote a request to the Auditor General. I have a lot of respect and trust in the Auditor General's integrity and their capabilities. I don't say that about many government agencies. Well, they're sort of an arm of Parliament rather than of the government. You won't hear me say that about many things in government, but the Auditor General I have a lot of respect and faith in, and I thought they did excellent work for the Commonwealth Games bid. So I requested what's called an assurance review, and it's possible for members of Parliament to put in requests to the Auditor General to do certain types of reviews on things. And that's actually up to the discretion of the Auditor General. It's not up at the discretion of the government. The Auditor General himself can make the decision whether or not to go ahead with that. It's my view that the Auditor General would have some really valuable knowledge and insights to be able to get to the bottom of some of this stuff. Specifically, I was requesting for them to look at a review of government procurement contracts, and specifically or especially around specialised labour hire firms. Now, the auditor actually has some very strong powers. So anyone that's worked in the private sector and has dealt with auditors before will know that when the auditors come in, you just meant to hand over everything to them. And it's the same in the public sector. When the Auditor General comes in and asks for documents, it's not like when I ask the government for documents and then they come back and say, oh, well, we're going to claim executive privilege, or we're going to claim, commercial incompetence and all this sort of stuff. The Auditor General, when he asks you for a document, you hand it over, and they've got the power to compel handover of documents. And I think that with their very specialised skill set, they're not going to be able to, you know, drag in witnesses, and they're not going to be able to make allegations of criminality and this sort of thing. But what they can do is look at, you know, were these processes followed correctly, and is there abnormalities in these processes, and maybe even what's the scale of it. And I think the Auditor General would have some excellent insights into those things, similar to what they did with the Commonwealth Games inquiry. So as the chair of the committee, the committee made the decision to you know, wait for the Auditor General to give us their analysis, because they have very good skills in that sort of area. They did a very comprehensive analysis of how much money did it actually cost taxpayers. It was somewhere in the order of $580 million. They calculated it through very detailed means. And it would be my hope that maybe they can do something like that for what's been going on in the construction sector. So we'll wait and see. I'm still waiting to hear back from the Auditor General, but I'm very hopeful that they will consider this within their capabilities to be able to do, and important enough that they'll make a decision to go ahead with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the questions that lots of people are so keen to know, is exactly how much, or roughly how much, is the taxpayer footing for this, you know, for this scheme, essentially, which a lot of the controversy has centered around the idea of it being organized crime, like there's bikies and stuff involved. I think, unfortunately, like the more pervasive part is not even the organized crime part of it. It's just how clearly hand in hand the CFMEU works with the Labor Party. I mean, we know Dan Andrews was often touted as being a slave to the unions and stuff like that. So is that part of the reason why? I mean, it makes more sense to me that you'd go for an avenue such as the what did you call it? Sorry, the Attorney General.
Auditor General.
Auditor General, rather than looking for the political means, because, I mean, Labor controls the lower house, Labor along with the Greens, and I think it was legalised cannabis that voted with them as well in the upper house, control the upper house. It's unlikely to get them to audit themselves when they are likely to be so compromised by this.
Look, there's a fair bit of let's say frostiness between the Labor Party and the CFMEU, is my understanding. There's been a lot of conflict between them, so I wouldn't say that they're, you know, one and the same thing, but certainly they attempt to influence each other, it would appear, quite strongly. But you know, if a select committee had have gotten up, it's not a fait accompli that it would be controlled by the government. Indeed, the select committee for the Commonwealth Games is not controlled by the government at all. That, you know, there's three government MPs, 3 opposition MPs, and 3 crossbench MPs.
Okay.
So a majority is 5. So it's impossible for the government to control it. I'm one of those crossbench MPs, so it's not possible. There's also there's me, a Green, and One Nation MP. So it's actually not possible for the government to control that committee. It could have been the case that this select committee, if it got up, wouldn't have been controlled by the government. But select committees, they do have fairly extensive powers, but one thing that it can't do, and this was the government's excuse for not agreeing to it, I think it's a pathetic excuse, this was also the Greens' excuse, was that it doesn't have the power to compel lower house MPs. It has the power to compel upper house MPs. It also has the power to compel any member of the public that they choose. Actually has quite wide-ranging powers. You can summons or subpoena pretty much anyone in the state of Victoria and compel them to appear. But it can't compel lower house MPs, but it can request that they appear. So the government's excuse for not supporting this is that because you can't compel our ministers to appear, we're not going to support it, even though they could choose to appear. And in fact, I attempted that process with the other select committee, with the Commonwealth Games Select Committee, and the Premier chose not to appear. I went through the formal process. There is actually a formal process in Parliament to effectively send a message to the lower house requesting that a member of them will appear. There is a precedent for that has happened before, but they just used an excuse basically to not support it, I think. And the Greens knew that as well, but they used an excuse too. So I was pretty disappointed with that, I'd say.
How likely do you think we are to see something come out of this of actual substance, something that would be, you know, damning to the people that it should be damning to, but also to the extremities of all the government that is inevitably involved here? How likely do you think it is that we'll see something satisfying?
Look, I would be happiest. Look, I know that people want heads to roll and all that sort of stuff, but I mean, seriously, that's going to take years and years and years, right? Like if they had a royal commission, let's say the government was even enthusiastic about a royal commission, these things take a long time. And this review that that the government is setting up, that's probably going to take a long time to. Do I have confidence that it's going to give us good results? Well, you know, I've seen these sort of reviews before, like the Coat inquiry. Wasn't particularly happy with that. You know, lots of I cannot recalls. Wasn't particularly happy with that. What I've been speaking about and trying to focus on, you know, a positive libertarian solution here. Look at the root causes of these things, right? And I think libertarians are very good at understanding the root causes and the incentives of organised crime. What causes these things to exist in the first place? Now, I think an obvious thing with what we've seen so far, and hopefully the Auditor General can shed some more light on it, but an obvious thing is these labour diversity requirements in the procurement requirements, right? I think that we should rethink whether that's actually a good idea or not. And my preference would be that procurement contracts, as I said, should focus on quality, price, and ability to deliver. That should be the primary focus of any government procurement. And these other things, maybe we should rethink whether they're actually working for Victorians. I don't think they are. And of course, there's many other examples of government policy which actually incentivizes this type of corruption. I think planning would be another obvious one.
I do want to harken back to, I think the last time that most people in our libertarian or generally anti-government expansion world remembers the CFMEU because, and especially how they coordinated with Labor back then, because we remember very distinctly the tradie protests against the CFMEU in 2021, when the CFMEU essentially betrayed their members and went along with the government vaccine mandates. And there were elements of organized crime that kind of popped their head there in certain facets. And there was this feeling that this thing, you know, the union, which is supposed to represent members and fight for their rights and stuff, was very much compromised. So do you see any correlations between what we saw then? Are there any links that you think are important to draw between what was happening then and what we're seeing now?
Absolutely, there are. So back in September 2021, I was actually there with a couple of my staff. We went to witness it because, you know, as I've said many times, I don't trust the media and what the government says about these things. I thought I'd go and see what's going on with my own two eyes. I went and spoke to a lot of the workers there. I was actually quite surprised that a lot of them knew who I was, which was sort of good, I suppose, and a bit scary too. But yeah, they were primarily concerned about vaccine mandates. They had other concerns too, such as the sheds where they have their lunch. That was considered a hard-won right to, you know, they don't like eating their lunch outside in the weather, right? They'd fought to have sheds on site, and it was a fair enough thing that they were upset about closing the sheds. That was sort of a secondary thing, though, to the vaccine mandates, which was their primary thing that they were upset about. And the interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize on the day is that initially they were all very optimistic that they could convince the union bosses to, like, they were chanting, lead us, lead us. They were chanting, they wanted Setka and the union bosses to march to Parliament and negotiate with the government on their behalf to fight against these vaccine mandates. And the union bosses themselves had never been publicly supportive of vaccine mandates, right? They'd never come out. So they were very careful and hadn't said that they were supportive of vaccine mandates at all, at least in the CFMEU. I'm not aware of them saying that they were supportive of it. And they were very optimistic. The people I spoke to in the morning, at least, were saying, you know, we think that they should do this, and we're here to let them know our position, and we want them to lead us to Parliament and you know, talk to the government, right? But then later on, it became apparent that that wasn't going to happen. And then Setka was on the radio and basically, you know, started saying they're right-wing extremists. And then there was this big coordinated campaign. You had all these union leaders all over the state and then all over the country, actually, talking about, you know, man-baby Nazis and right-wing extremists had infiltrated the union movement. And basically, they just got thrown under the bus.
Yeah.
Now, the connection between that and today is there seemed to be, at the time in 2021, many people, both in the government and in the union movement, who seemed to know everything about nefarious elements that had infiltrated the CFMEU. They seemed to all be experts on it, in fact, and had lots of opinions on it. Yet somehow now, when you ask them about it, they know nothing about organised crime being involved, nothing at all. And so my conclusion is that either they had to be lying back then or they're lying now, one or the other. You can't be an expert on, you know, the union being infiltrated at one point in time and then all of a sudden not an expert at another point in time, right? I just don't, I'm not buying it. No sale from me.
Seems much more likely that they'd be lying about it now because the incentive now is to not know anything, whereas the incentive then was, you know, to share that expertise. I mean, it seems weird to...
I'm quite certain that they were lying about it back then. Whether or not they're lying about it now is another question, really. But, you know, they were saying that they were fake tradies and stuff, right? Everyone was like,
right,
but
yeah.
I mean, I talked to these people. They weren't fake tradies. Like, it's just nuts, right? But they needed to distance themselves from these people. So that's how they did it, by smearing them. And, you know, it happened many times during the pandemic. It wasn't just union workers. They did it with lots of people. Lots of groups of people that showed opposition to the government, they smeared them and tried to isolate them.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people who probably watch this show have got PTSD about that period. So, you know, bringing that up is just fuels the fire and reminds us that, you know, the government is not our friend, especially not in times like that. So I did want to talk about recently, sort of in the last week or so, you've had a bit of, well, you've had some ideas, a sort of 5-point plan type of thing of ways that we could actually fix, clean up Victoria, essentially. And you've gotten some media attention for it, which is great. So would you mind running through what some of these ideas are and how they might get to the root of the problem? As you said, libertarians are quite good at getting to the root of things.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the things that I spoke about even in my inaugural speech after I got elected is about prohibition, like drug prohibition specifically. And I related it back to alcohol prohibition in the 1920s in the United States and all of the organized crime that blossomed under alcohol prohibition. Basically, we've got the same thing happening in Victoria right now. And it's not just like traditional drugs like heroin and cannabis and these sorts of things, but we've got new drugs now, which is namely nicotine. So both through tobacco and vaping. Now, what I wanted to do is to show that, you know, we can have some sort of positive solution that, rather than focus on enforcement, use the power of economics to undermine criminal markets. And so the way to do that, these 5 ideas, the first one was to put pressure on the federal government to lower tobacco excise tax. Anyone that lives in Victoria can't miss the fact that we've had, I think, 80-odd arson attacks throughout the city on tobacconists and other shops related to this. This is because we have a number of criminal syndicates that have been incentivized to sell black market tobacco, so smuggled in tobacco, because the difference between the smuggled tobacco and the tobacco with the crazy excise tax is a huge incentive. Basically, the difference between the market price and the taxed price creates an incentive. The higher the tax goes, the more incentive there is to get around the tax. And so the first thing I said was, let's consider lowering tobacco excise tax. That will lower the criminal incentive and therefore these syndicates won't have an incentive. Now, the reason that we have the firebombings is because you've got these groups competing with each other. That only really happens in a market that's like close to saturation, right? Because when the black market is growing, the syndicates aren't stepping on each other's toes. But anyone that understands black markets will know that there's no real peaceful means of settling disputes, so they resort to violence. If it was a legal market, you would have courts and marketing and things like that would resolve disputes, but you can't do that in a black market. So they attack each other through violent means. People have been saying, oh, why is it only happening in Victoria? It's not only happening in Victoria. Certainly Victoria is leading it. I note that there was an attack in Brisbane just yesterday or the day before. What it is I think the Victorian market has been saturated first. It will happen in other markets, is my view. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, rather stupidly, the government has prohibited vaping. So vaping is a means for people who smoke to get off tobacco and do that as a less harmful means of ingesting nicotine. And they've prohibited that. And of course, the black market will provide, and they have provided. You can buy them anywhere in Victoria. They're all provided by organised crime. Most of the vapes, unlike tobacco, which have a diversity of places where they come from, most of the vapes come from China. They're disposable ones, which have never been legal in the Victorian market, by the way. And so they're going nuts on the black market, but legalising them is for adults is a really simple thing to do, I think.
Sorry, just on the vaping, something
Yeah.
insane. I spoke to a guy whose vaping shop has just been recently closed because of the new laws. And I don't think most people realize this, is that, yeah, those cheap little throwaway vapes that we see most of the time with the enormously high amounts of nicotine that come from, China and stuff, they've always been illegal. What they've done now is they've made illegal these really established shops which are into the whole culture of vaping, where they've been established for 30 years. They have a community around them. The idea is, like, some of them aren't even nicotine based. It's almost a collector's niche, and they've just broad strokes completely destroyed this industry. And that's the only industry that there was. That was the only one that was legal. The little Chinese vapes were already illegal.
Yeah, and so you've never been able to buy, not in recent times, you've never been able to buy the liquid that had nicotine in it at those vape shops. So there was a workaround, though. What would happen is there's, to our east, there's a country that's more sensible than us on this, which is New Zealand. And of course, they've legalized it. In fact, they encourage it as a way of getting off tobacco. In fact, lots of sensible countries, more sensible than us, have done that. The UK is another one. And so what people would do they'd put an order in on the internet, and then it would get sent across from New Zealand to Australia, and then you'd get the juice, and then you could buy the actual gadgets that you vape from and get advice from the people in the shop, which is really important to a lot of people. So you can go into the shop, you can buy the stuff, you can buy the actual vape and the supplies and whatever. And then for the actual juice that's got the nicotine in it, you order it from New Zealand. Many people were happily doing that, and they're not allowed to do that anymore for two reasons. Border Force have shut down all the website connections, and if you try and import it, they'll intercept it. And they've also shut down the vape shops. It's illegal to sell vapes. Even if you don't have nicotine in them, it's still illegal to sell them, which is nuts. Like, it's absolutely nuts. But here we are.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So you were going on to your next of the 5 points.
Yeah. So the other one, cannabis. So we want to legalize cannabis. That is another market in Victoria. That's about $1 billion. Again, totally controlled by organised crime. Some people can access the medical cannabis market now in Victoria. That's become a lot easier to access for patients of medical cannabis. But for recreational cannabis, and even some medical cannabis users who find the system too hard to navigate, they will still buy from the black market. That's another market that we could rip out another $1 billion out of organised crime, just like that, and all the corruption and money laundering and everything that goes with it. The next idea was around, I think I mentioned it before, changing government procurement policies to get rid of these diversity requirements, or at least review them, because I think that they're not actually providing the benefits that are claimed by the government. I think that they're actually incentivizing organised crime as an unintended consequence. And the last thing is around what they call pharmacotherapy. Basically, this is looking at the heroin market. So the heroin market is about $250 million in Victoria. The government, to their credit, have expanded pharmacotherapy in Victoria with more options. So what pharmacotherapy is if someone wants to get off heroin, they can use an opiate substitute drug. Historically, there's only been sort of methadone. Everyone's sort of heard of methadone. It's a substitute. But there's other substitutes, Suboxone, buprenorphine, and a new one, which the Libertarian Party has been pushing for a long time for the government to try, called hydromorphone, which is actually quite similar to heroin, really. But what it does is it means that for every person who has addiction issues with heroin, they would have an option to use these other drugs and get them stabilized, get them out of the hands of organised crime. And rather than dealing with, organised crime, police, courts, and prison system, they'd be dealing with, families, community groups, health providers, and addiction specialists, right? And I think that this is a great benefit. It actually would save taxpayers a lot of money, because long-term consequences for acquired brain injury from heroin overdose are like insanely expensive. It sort of can take away someone's productivity for the rest of their life if they get an acquired brain injury from this. That's one of the common things that happens with overdose. So my idea there was to accelerate what they're already doing and make it go out much faster. There's another big scary thing that's that you would have seen overseas with the heroin markets, is there's like super high potency opiates like fentanyl and nitazines. I've been terrified for a long time that they're going to come to Victoria and we'll end up with, zombies walking the streets and bodies everywhere, like what we're seeing in the United States. I don't want that to happen. And one way of really dealing with that is getting people away from organised crime and stabilised on pharmacotherapy. I think that it's a very, very positive thing that we can do to both help people who've got problems with drugs, but also undermine organised crime markets. Now, if you look at all these markets together, we've got studies by the Parliamentary Budget Office. The heroin market's about $250 million. The vaping market in Victoria is about $500 million. We estimate, I think from figures I've read, that the tobacco market and the cannabis market, probably those together is about $2 billion. So we're looking at $3-4 billion of organised crime activity just in those things that I've suggested. Now, I'm not saying that these 5 actions would eliminate all organised crime. Of course it won't. There's other drugs that we don't have good solutions for. There's other things that organised crime does. But certainly this would make a big, big dent in organised crime. And that's why I've been pushing so hard for it. And I think it's good that we show that we have positive solutions for these things. And the major parties have just been saying, oh, let's have an inquiry and let's spend more money on cops. And they're just playing whack-a-mole with the consequences of their bad policy. I'd rather us focus on what's the root cause of the incentives for organised crime and how can we deal with that in a different way. And I'm glad that the mainstream media is actually reporting on these sort of things, like to get the Herald Sun talking about, cannabis and tobacco excise cuts and opiate substitutes. I'm really encouraged that the mainstream media is willing to, see these things as things worth discussing. And it was also on the television this week as well. So I'm very happy that we've got that conversation happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a conversation that has to happen, and it seems initially when you think for the average person, it seems immediately counterintuitive. Like, okay, we have these problems with these drugs, but we're going to legalize them, and that will get rid of the black market. And then when you sort of go step by step and explain it, it's undeniable that this is the cause and effect of what would happen. And yet the government or the major parties, certainly, their solution is what? I mean, these things are already illegal. What are they going to super
Yeah, I
ban
mean,
them? Like that seems to be their outcome.
yeah. Like the Labor Party says, we're going to have an inquiry and we're going to have more cops. And then the Liberal Party says, we want a Royal Commission and more cops. And like, you know, we know that we can't police these things. Like if you look at established drug markets, you know, it's hard to get good data on it. But I think anyone who understands, you know, illicit drug markets would say that the law enforcement is lucky to intercept maybe 3%. 3% in a good year, maybe you would intercept. And, you know, when you consider that in a legal market, GST alone is 10%, it's easy for organized crime to just write off 3% of their stock. And they structure their businesses, which is what it is, it's a black market business. They structure it in such a way that the people that get pinged for this sort of stuff never hurt anyone higher up the chain. You know, it's always their minions that are sort of disposable. And, you know, they structure it in such a way that, you know, they can afford to lose 3% of their product. They don't care.
Yeah, and it's incredible how having this conversation is so difficult, despite the fact that we all have the glaring example of how prohibition on alcohol didn't work. Like that's historically known by everyone. Everyone knows that, you know, they have the speakeasies and the
Al
bootleg
Capone.
moonshine. Yeah. And yet they can't make the link that this is exactly the same for all these other substances, which a huge portion of the population clearly wants to consume. Otherwise, how would we have these $1 billion of market? It's like
Yeah.
the option is to ignore it instead.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about prohibition, like the first thing that happened when prohibition came in is beer disappeared from the market, right? Because there's no incentive to smuggle something that's like low potency. So everything went to whiskey. And then, of course, you got adulterated products that had methanol mixed in them by accident that would kill people. You know, is all this sounding familiar with what we're seeing with drugs, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the same thing. And then you had these big gangsters that would take over. It was interesting. Like some people ask me, "Oh, why are you interested in getting the Auditor General on this? Why not, you know, all these other like cops or enforcement agencies?" And my response to that is, when they got Al Capone, they didn't get him for murder, they didn't get him for trafficking, they didn't get him for extortion, they got him for tax. It was the auditors that got him.
That's funny. Of all the things that he's done, the worst crime in the eyes of the government is not paying your taxes. That's
Well, that's what
that's
they got
very
him on in
telling.
the end. Yeah, that's what they got him on in the end. They couldn't get him on anything else, but they got him over tax. So yeah.
Says something very deep about our overlords. Anyway, look, thank you so much for your time, David. I've really appreciated having this chat with you. I hope that this has been informative. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we left? Anything important that you think we might have missed?
Look, I'd encourage people to, you know, if you care about cleaning up our state and getting rid of this organized crime and corruption, be open-minded about different solutions like what we're talking about. I'm sure there's other solutions that I haven't proposed that people might want to come up with, and maybe you can contact my office and maybe we can get them in the media, right? But like, I'm really encouraged that at least we're at the point where the media is able to discuss these things in a sensible way. I've had surprisingly little, you know, a bit of feedback to you and everyone else. I've had surprisingly few people attack me on this. I think everyone understands that the economics of this are absolutely sound. It's really a matter of whether there's a political will to do it. Whether or not there's a political will depends on how many people organize and get behind it. And that's what, you know, I'm trying to do as a you know, member of the Libertarian Party and a member in the wider libertarian movement, is to try and get these ideas into the mainstream so that we can, you know, fix this state, because it's just so rotten.
I think it's safe to say that we need more of you and more voices like yours in Victorian Parliament and federal Parliament if we can get them. So this should be a bit of a rallying call to anyone listening. If you want these kind of ideas, it's libertarians that you need to elect into something close to positions of power. I know our power is limited until we get more of those numbers. Where can people find you, David?
Yeah, so if you go to davidlimbrick.com.au, you can look at my website. I'm also on X, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram.
All right. And we too, here on Collectivitis, we're on Spotify, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again for joining us, David, and we will catch you next time.
See you, mate.